The last thing I remember before impact was the sound of tires screeching, not in panic or desperation, but with deliberate precision. Then 2 tons of steel and malice slammed into my body at 40 miles per hour, launching me 30 feet across the parking lot of Riverside Shopping Center. As I lay there with 3 broken ribs, a shattered pelvis, and internal bleeding, my Aunt Cordelia knelt beside me and whispered, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Brandon just lost control of the car. It was an accident." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Alexandra Kane, and from wherever you're watching this, stay with me, because what I discovered in that hospital room and what those tire marks in the asphalt would eventually prove exposed a family conspiracy so twisted that it changed everything I thought I knew about blood, loyalty, and the lengths people will go to destroy someone they're supposed to love. But let me take you back to the morning that started it all, because the attempted murder that left me fighting for my life wasn't random violence. It was the culmination of 23 years of family resentment, hidden jealousy, and a secret that my cousin Brandon thought was worth killing for. October 15th began like any ordinary Tuesday in Millbrook Falls. I woke up in my downtown apartment, made coffee, and reviewed my notes for the morning meeting at Hartwell and Associates, the law firm where I'd been working as a junior partner for the past 2 years. At 28, I was the youngest attorney in the firm's history to make partner, an achievement that had filled me with pride and my family with what I was beginning to understand was something much darker than simple jealousy. The meeting that morning was about the Morrison estate case, a complex inheritance dispute that had been dragging through the courts for 18 months. My client, elderly Eugene Morrison, had died leaving behind a will that disinherited his gambling-addicted son in favor of a local children's charity. The son was contesting, claiming his father lacked mental capacity when the will was written. It was exactly the kind of intricate legal puzzle I thrived on, requiring careful analysis of medical records, witness testimony, and financial documents. What I didn't know that morning was that this case would become the catalyst for my own family's attempt to destroy me. At 11:30 a.m., I received a call from my Aunt Cordelia, my father's sister, a woman who had always treated me with the kind of suffocating affection that feels more possessive than loving. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Alexandra, darling, I need to speak with you urgently. Can you meet me for lunch today? It's about family business." Family business. In the Kane family, that phrase usually meant money, property, or someone's reputation was at stake. My father's side of the family had built their wealth through 3 generations of shrewd real estate investments and careful business dealings. They owned half the commercial properties in Millbrook Falls, and they guarded that empire with the kind of fierce protectiveness that makes normal family relationships impossible. "What kind of family business, Aunt Cordelia?" "It's better discussed in person. Can you meet me at Giovanni's at 1 o'clock? I checked my calendar. I had depositions scheduled for the afternoon, but I could squeeze in a quick lunch. In retrospect, that flexibility nearly cost me my life. I'll be there. Giovanni's was a small Italian restaurant in the heart of Millbrook Falls Historic District, the kind of place where local business deals were made over plates of osso buco and glasses of Chianti. I'd eaten there countless times with family members, colleagues, and clients. It felt safe, familiar, unremarkable. Aunt Cordelia was already seated when I arrived, her silver hair perfectly styled and her expression carrying the kind of careful neutrality that I'd learned to recognize as dangerous. She wasn't alone. My cousin, Brandon, sat across from her, fidgeting with his phone and avoiding eye contact. Brandon Kane was 3 years older than me, the son of my father's brother, Thomas. We'd grown up together at family gatherings, shared Christmas mornings and summer vacations, but we'd never been particularly close. He was the kind of person who coasted through life on family connections and natural charm, working various jobs in the family business empire without ever showing much ambition or drive. Still, I'd never had any reason to dislike him. He was just there, part of the family landscape. Alexandra, thank you for coming. Aunt Cordelia's voice was warmer than her expression. Please, sit down. We need to discuss something important. I slid into the booth beside Brandon, immediately noticing the tension radiating from his body. He looked exhausted, stressed in a way that went beyond simple work fatigue. "What's going on?" I asked, signaling the waiter for coffee. Aunt Cordelia glanced around the restaurant as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned forward conspiratorially. "It's about Uncle Eugene's will, the Morrison case you're handling." My blood went cold. Eugene Morrison wasn't actually related to us. The Uncle Eugene nickname was a remnant from childhood when he'd been a close family friend and business associate of my grandfather's. But the Morrison estate case was supposed to be confidential attorney-client privilege. How did my family know I was representing him? "I can't discuss client matters, Aunt Cordelia. You know that." Of course, of course. But Alexandra, there are things about that case that you don't understand. Complications that could affect the family. I set down my coffee cup carefully, my legal training kicking into high alert. What kind of complications? Brandon finally looked up from his phone, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Desperation mixed with something that might have been hatred.
"The charity," he said quietly. "The children's charity that Eugene left everything to. It's not what you think it is." "What do you mean?" Aunt Cordelia reached across the table and placed her hand over mine with the kind of maternal gesture that had always made me uncomfortable. "Sweetheart, that charity is a front. It was set up by Eugene and your grandfather 15 years ago to hide assets from tax authorities. The money isn't going to help children. It's going to be distributed back to the families who contributed to it, specifically to us." I stared at her, processing this information. If what she was saying was true, then my client's will wasn't a generous donation to help disadvantaged kids. It was an elaborate tax evasion scheme that would make me complicit in financial fraud. "That's impossible. I've reviewed all the charity's documentation. It's legitimate." "The paperwork is legitimate," Brandon said, "but the purpose isn't. Alexandra, if you successfully defend that will, you'll be helping to execute a multi-million-dollar fraud. And when the authorities figure it out, and they will, you'll be the lawyer who facilitated it." The implications hit me like cold water. My career, my reputation, my law license, everything I'd worked for could be destroyed if I unknowingly participated in financial fraud. Even if I was an innocent party, the Legal Ethics Board wouldn't see it that way. "Why are you telling me this now? The case goes to trial next month." Aunt Cordelia squeezed my hand. "Because we care about you. Because we want to protect you from making a mistake that could ruin your life." "What do you want me to do?" "Drop the case," Brandon said immediately. "Find a reason to withdraw as counsel. Let Eugene's son win the inheritance dispute. The money will go to him instead of the charity, and you'll be protected from any legal consequences." I looked back and forth between them, my mind racing through the legal and ethical implications of what they were asking. Withdrawing from a case without just cause was a violation of professional ethics, but defending a fraudulent will would be worse. "I need time to think about this, and I need to verify what you're telling me." "Of course," Aunt Cordelia said, "but Alexandra, time is not our friend here. The trial date is approaching, and if you're going to withdraw, it needs to be soon." "How soon?" "This week. Tomorrow, ideally." The urgency in his voice triggered something in my legal instincts. In my experience, when clients or family members pressured me to make quick decisions about complex cases, it usually meant someone was hiding something important. "I'll review the case file tonight and give you an answer tomorrow." "Thank you, sweetheart." Aunt Cordelia smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know this is difficult, but we're trying to protect you." As I walked back to my office that afternoon, something nagged at me about the conversation. The charity story felt wrong somehow. Not necessarily false, but incomplete. In 3 years of practicing law, I'd developed a sixth sense for when people weren't telling me the whole truth. That evening, I spread the Morrison case files across my dining room table and began a methodical review of every document, every piece of evidence, every witness statement I'd collected over the past 18 months. If there was fraud involved, I would find it. What I found instead was something much more disturbing. The charity was legitimate. Not just legitimate, but exemplary. Children's Future Foundation had been operating for 15 years, providing scholarships, medical care, and educational support to disadvantaged kids throughout the state. Their financial records were transparent, their board of directors was composed of respected community leaders, and their programs had measurably improved the lives of thousands of children. More importantly, I found no connection whatsoever between the charity and my family's business interests. No shared board members, no financial relationships, no hidden partnerships. Eugene Morrison's will was exactly what it appeared to be: a generous donation from a man who wanted his wealth to help children after his death. So why had my family lied to me? I stayed up until 2 a.m. that night, going through financial records and tax documents, trying to understand what Brandon and Aunt Cordelia were really afraid of. The answer came in a folder I'd almost overlooked: correspondence between Eugene Morrison and his attorney from 2 years earlier, when the will was being drafted. In those letters, Eugene described his decision to disinherit his son in detail, but he also mentioned something else: his suspicion that certain family friends had been taking advantage of his generosity over the years, borrowing money they never intended to repay, and manipulating business deals to their advantage. The letters specifically mentioned Thomas Kane and his family as people who had taken more than their share and who would undoubtedly challenge this will when they realized their gravy train has ended. Thomas Kane, Brandon's father, my uncle. Suddenly, the lunch conversation made perfect sense. This wasn't about protecting me from legal consequences. This was about my family's fear that Eugene Morrison's will would expose their financial relationship with him, a relationship that apparently involved unpaid loans and questionable business practices. If Brandon's father had been borrowing money from Eugene Morrison with no intention of repaying it, and if that debt was significant enough to worry about legal consequences, then they had a powerful motive to prevent the will from being executed. They needed Eugene's gambling-addicted son to inherit so they could negotiate debt forgiveness with someone desperate for money and easy to manipulate. I was the only thing standing between them and that outcome. The next morning, I called Aunt Cordelia and told her I'd decided to continue with the case. The charity was legitimate, Eugene Morrison had been mentally competent when he signed the will, and I had an ethical obligation to defend my client's wishes. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished explaining my decision. "Alexandra, I think you're making a mistake. A big mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." "Yes," she said quietly. "I suppose it is." That afternoon, I had a meeting with the opposing counsel in the Morrison case, the attorney representing Eugene's son. We discussed potential settlement options and trial scheduling, the kind of routine legal business that fills most of my working days. As I walked to my car afterward, I was thinking about witness preparation and exhibit lists, not family drama or financial fraud. I never saw Brandon's car coming. The impact happened so fast that my brain couldn't process the sequence of events in real time. Later, reviewing security footage and police reports, I would understand that Brandon had been waiting in the shopping center parking lot for over an hour, watching for my red Honda Civic to appear. When I walked out of the legal building at 4:30 p.m., he started his engine and began calculating angles and timing. As I crossed the parking lot toward my car, lost in thought about the Morrison case, Brandon accelerated from his position near the back exit. He drove straight toward me, not the erratic path of someone who had lost control, but the deliberate trajectory of someone aiming for maximum impact. The security camera captured everything: Brandon's car approaching at speed, my moment of recognition and terror as I turned and saw him coming, the sickening collision that launched my body through the air like a rag doll. It also captured what happened next: Brandon slamming on his brakes after impact, not before it. But in the moments immediately following the attack, as I lay broken on the asphalt with blood pooling beneath me and my vision fading in and out of focus, I wasn't thinking about security footage or evidence preservation. I was thinking about the expression on Brandon's face in the split second before he hit me. It wasn't panic. It wasn't the face of someone who had accidentally lost control of their vehicle. It was determination. Aunt Cordelia arrived at the scene before the paramedics, which should have been my first clue that this wasn't the random accident she claimed it was. She knelt beside me in her pristine white coat, her face a mask of concern and shock. "Oh, Alexandra, you poor thing. Brandon is beside himself. He said the accelerator got stuck and he couldn't stop in time. These new cars, sometimes the electronics malfunction." Through my haze of pain and trauma, I heard her words and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not just the physical cold of shock and blood loss, but the emotional cold of recognizing a lie being constructed in real time. The accelerator got stuck, electronics malfunction. Even in my semi-conscious state, I knew those explanations didn't match what I'd experienced. The car hadn't been accelerating out of control, it had been aimed. As the paramedics loaded me onto a stretcher and into the ambulance, I caught a glimpse of Brandon standing beside his damaged vehicle, talking earnestly with a police officer. From a distance, he looked appropriately shaken and distressed. But I'd grown up with him. I knew his tells, his expressions, his ways of manipulating situations to his advantage. He wasn't traumatized by what he had done. He was worried about whether it had worked. The ride to Millbrook Falls General Hospital was a blur of sirens, medical jargon, and increasing pain as the adrenaline wore off, and my injuries made themselves known. 3 broken ribs, hairline fractures in my left leg, severe bruising across my back and shoulders, and internal bleeding that required emergency surgery. As they wheeled me into the operating room, my last conscious thought was about tire marks. Specifically, about the pattern of skid marks that Brandon's car must have left on the parking lot asphalt. If he'd really lost control, if the accelerator had really malfunctioned, those marks would tell a story of panic and desperation. But if I was right about what really happened, they would tell a very different story. They would show that someone had tried to kill me, and that someone was my own cousin. The question was, would anyone believe me when I woke up? I woke up 48 hours later in the ICU with tubes running from my body like the roots of some medical tree, and the first person I saw was Detective Ray Castellanos from the Millbrook Falls Police Department. He was a man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from 2 decades of dealing with humanity's worst impulses. What I didn't expect was the notebook in his hands and the skeptical expression on his face. "Miss Kane," he said when he noticed my eyes were open and focused, "I'm glad to see you're awake. I need to ask you some questions about what happened in that parking lot." My throat felt like sandpaper, but I managed to croak out, "The tire marks. Did you examine the tire marks?" Detective Castellanos raised an eyebrow. "That's an interesting first question. Most people ask about their injuries or their family. Yes, we examined the scene thoroughly, but I'd like to hear your version of what happened first." Over the next 30 minutes, fighting through pain medication and the fog of trauma, I told him everything. The lunch meeting with Aunt Cordelia and Brandon, their lies about the charity, my discovery of the real financial relationship between my uncle and Eugene Morrison, and most importantly, my certainty that Brandon had deliberately aimed his car at me. "The look on his face," I said, my voice getting stronger as the medication wore off. It wasn't panic. It wasn't the face of someone who had accidentally lost control of their vehicle. It was determination. Detective Castellanos took notes without commenting, his expression remaining professionally neutral. When I finished, he closed his notebook and leaned back in the uncomfortable hospital chair. "Miss Kane, I have to tell you that your cousin and aunt have given very different statements about what happened. According to both of them, Brandon was pulling out of a parking space when his accelerator stuck. He couldn't brake in time.
and you walked directly into his path. That's a lie.
Maybe, but I need more than your word against theirs to pursue criminal charges. Do you have any evidence to support your version of events? The tire marks, I repeated. If he lost control, the skid marks will show panic braking. If he aimed for me, they'll show a deliberate path with braking only after impact. Detective Castellanos nodded slowly. We did photograph the scene extensively. The crime scene team documented all physical evidence, including tire marks, paint transfer, and debris patterns. And I'd like to get a second opinion on the analysis before I share conclusions with you. There are some inconsistencies in the physical evidence that don't match the statements we've received. Hope flared in my chest, followed immediately by a spike of pain from my broken ribs. What kind of inconsistencies? The kind that suggests someone hasn't been entirely truthful about what happened that afternoon. After Detective Castellanos left, I spent the rest of the day staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the situation I found myself in. My own family had attempted to murder me over a legal case, not even for money directly, but to prevent the exposure of financial improprieties that might not even rise to the level of criminal fraud. The calculations seemed insane until I started thinking about it from their perspective. If Uncle Thomas owed Eugene Morrison significant money that he'd never intended to repay, and if that debt was documented in Eugene Morrison's personal papers, then Eugene's will could expose Thomas to civil lawsuits or criminal charges. Brandon's father might lose his business, his reputation, possibly his freedom. From that angle, eliminating the lawyer who was ensuring the will's execution might seem like a reasonable solution. But there was something else. Something deeper that I was beginning to understand about my family's dynamics. I'd always been the outsider, the one who'd succeeded through education and hard work rather than family connections and inherited wealth. My legal career, my partnership at the firm, my professional reputation, all of it existed outside their control, and that had always made them uncomfortable. The attempted murder wasn't just about the Morrison case. It was about power, control, and the threat that an independent family member posed to their carefully constructed world of secrets and manipulation. That evening, my law partner David Hartwell came to visit, bringing flowers and a stack of legal files that made me groan, despite the relief at seeing a familiar face. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into the chair beside my bed. "Like I got hit by a car, literally." I managed a weak smile. "But David, I need to tell you something about the Morrison case, something that changes everything." I explained the family lunch, the lies about the charity, and my discovery of the financial relationship between my uncle and Eugene Morrison. David listened with the same focused attention he brought to complex legal arguments, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just absorbing information. "Alexandra," he said when I finished, "if your family was willing to attempt murder to stop this case, then there's more money involved than we realized. Much more." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I think we need to take a much deeper look at Eugene Morrison's financial records. Not just the will and the charity donation, but his entire business relationship with your family going back years." David spent the next day subpoenaing bank records, business documents, and correspondence between Eugene Morrison and various Kane enterprises. What he found was staggering in its scope and audacity. Over the past 15 years, Uncle Thomas had borrowed nearly $3 million from Eugene Morrison through a series of informal loans and investment partnerships. The money had been used to finance real estate deals, business expansions, and personal expenses for the entire extended Kane family. But instead of formal repayment schedules, the agreements had been structured as profits-sharing arrangements that somehow never generated profits for Morrison. In effect, my family had been systematically defrauding a trusting elderly man for over a decade, using his generosity to fund their lifestyle while providing minimal returns on his investments. "Alexandra," David said, showing me the documents on his laptop screen, "this isn't just about preventing embarrassment. If Eugene's estate executor discovers these financial arrangements and decides to pursue recovery, your family could be looking at millions of dollars in civil judgments, and if there's evidence of intentional fraud, criminal charges. So they decided to kill me instead of facing the consequences of their actions." "It appears so. But there's something else you need to know.
I've been in contact with Detective Castellanos, and the physical evidence from the crime scene supports your version of events completely. My heart rate spiked, causing the monitors beside my bed to beep frantically until I forced myself to breathe slowly. What did they find? The tire marks show a deliberate acceleration pattern, not panic braking. Brandon's car was traveling at nearly 50 miles per hour at the moment of impact, with no evidence of attempted braking until after he hit you. There's also security camera footage from 3 different angles that shows him waiting in the parking lot for over an hour before you arrived. So they have proof it was attempted murder? They have proof it was intentional. Whether it rises to attempted murder depends on Brandon's intent and mental state, but at minimum, it's assault with a deadly weapon. That afternoon, Detective Castellanos returned with a different energy entirely. Instead of skeptical questioning, he brought the focused intensity of someone building a criminal case. Miss Kane, I need to inform you that we're filing charges against your cousin Brandon Kane for attempted vehicular homicide and conspiracy to commit assault. We're also investigating your Aunt Cordelia Kane as a potential accomplice. What changed your mind? Evidence. The security footage shows Brandon's car positioned to have clear sightlines of the building exit. He started his engine the moment you appeared, then accelerated directly towards you. There's no question this was intentional.
What about his story about the accelerator malfunction? Detective Castellanos smiled grimly. We impounded his vehicle for mechanical inspection. There's nothing wrong with the accelerator, the brakes, or any other system. The car was functioning perfectly at the time of the attack. And Aunt Cordelia? She was on scene remarkably fast for someone who supposedly just happened to be in the area. Cell phone records show she was in contact with Brandon throughout the afternoon, including a call that lasted 6 minutes, beginning exactly 10 minutes before you left your meeting. We believe she was providing updates on your location and schedule. The pieces were falling into place with the satisfying precision of a complex legal argument, but I needed to understand the full scope of what my family had been willing to do. Detective, how close did I come to dying? His expression grew serious. If you'd been 6 inches further into the parking lot when he hit you, or if your head had struck the pavement at a different angle, we'd be investigating a homicide instead of attempted murder. You're very lucky to be alive. Lucky. I didn't feel lucky lying in a hospital bed with multiple fractures and surgical scars, but I was beginning to understand that luck had indeed played a role in my survival, not just physically, but in the preservation of evidence that proved what had really happened. What happens now? Now we build the strongest possible case for attempted murder. And Ms. Kane, given what your attorney has shared about the financial motive, we're also opening a fraud investigation into your family's business dealings with Eugene Morrison. After Detective Castellanos left, I called David to discuss the legal implications of the criminal charges. As my law partner, he couldn't represent me in criminal matters, but he could advise me on the civil and professional consequences of what was unfolding. Alexandra, there's something else we need to discuss, he said. I've been contacted by the State Bar Association. Someone filed a complaint alleging that you've been involved in the financial fraud scheme with your family. My blood went cold. Someone? Who? The complaint was filed anonymously, but it alleges that you knew about the fraudulent loans to Morrison and were using the will case to cover up the family's financial improprieties. That's insane! I'm the victim here! I know that, and the evidence supports that, but we need to be prepared for a professional conduct investigation in addition to everything else. Someone is trying to destroy your legal career even after failing to kill you. The realization hit me like a second impact. This wasn't just about stopping the Morrison case or preventing financial exposure. This was about completely destroying me, physically, professionally, and personally. My family hadn't just tried to kill me, they'd tried to ensure that even if I survived, my career and reputation would be ruined. That evening, as I lay in the darkened hospital room listening to the sounds of medical equipment and distant conversations,
I made a decision that would define everything that came next. I wasn't just going to defend myself against false accusations or seek justice for the attempt on my life. I was going to expose everything, every financial impropriety, every manipulation, every lie my family had built their empire on. They'd tried to destroy me to protect their secrets, but instead, they'd given me the motivation and legal standing to destroy them. The next morning, I called David with my decision. I want to file a civil lawsuit against the entire Kane family enterprise: fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder, intentional infliction of emotional distress, everything we can prove. And I want to cooperate fully with the criminal investigation and the fraud inquiry. Alexandra, that's going to be brutal. You'll be fighting your own family in multiple courts simultaneously. They stopped being my family the moment Brandon aimed that car at me. And the Bar Association complaint? We fight it with everything we have. Because, David, I realized something lying here last night. They filed that complaint because they're terrified of what I might do now that I know the truth. They're trying to destroy me before I can expose them. That's probably accurate, and it means they're going to fight back hard. Let them fight. I have something they don't have. What's that? The truth, and tire marks that prove it. 3 days later, I was released from the hospital with a walking cast, prescription pain medication, and a briefcase full of evidence that would reshape my family's world. Brandon had been arrested and was being held without bail after the judge deemed him a flight risk. Aunt Cordelia had hired the most expensive criminal defense attorney in the state and was maintaining her innocence despite mounting evidence of her complicity. But the most satisfying development came from an unexpected source. Eugene Morrison's estate executor, after reviewing the financial documents David had uncovered, filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the Kane family enterprises for recovery of fraudulent loans and profits. The civil case would run parallel to the criminal investigations, creating a legal web that would be impossible for my family to escape. As I sat in my apartment that first night home, reviewing police reports and legal filings, I realized that Brandon's attempt to kill me had accomplished the exact opposite of what he intended. Instead of stopping the Morrison case and protecting family secrets, he'd triggered investigations that would expose decades of financial fraud and criminal behavior. The tire marks in that parking lot hadn't just proved his guilt. They'd become the foundation for bringing down an entire criminal enterprise disguised as a family business. Tomorrow, I would return to my law practice and begin the most important case of my career, seeking justice against the people who'd tried to murder me for doing my job honestly. But tonight, I was just grateful to be alive to fight back.
The first time I saw Brandon in court, 3 weeks after he'd tried to kill me, he looked like a stranger wearing my cousin's face. Gone was the casual confidence I'd grown up with, replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone who'd gambled everything on a single violent act and lost spectacularly. He sat between two expensive defense attorneys, his hands cuffed to a chain around his waist, refusing to meet my eyes as I took the witness stand. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to Eugene despite the name, presided over the preliminary hearing with the kind of stern efficiency that had made her reputation as one of the toughest judges in the county. She looked down at me from the bench as I was sworn in, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes holding a flicker of something that might have been sympathy. "Ms. Kane," she said, "please tell the court in your own words what happened on the afternoon of October 15th. I'd rehearsed this testimony with the prosecutor dozens of times, but sitting in that courtroom with Brandon 20 feet away, knowing that my own family members were scattered throughout the gallery, my voice caught for a moment before I found the strength to speak. I was walking to my car in the parking lot of Riverside Shopping Center when I heard tires screeching. When I turned around, I saw my cousin Brandon's vehicle accelerating directly toward me. There was no attempt to brake, no swerving to avoid impact. He drove straight into me with what appeared to be deliberate intent. Brandon's lead attorney, Marcus Whitfield, a man whose reputation for defending wealthy clients accused of violent crimes was matched only by his $800 per hour billing rate, objected immediately.
Your Honor, the witness is speculating about my client's mental state and intentions. She cannot possibly know what Mr. Kane was thinking or intending in the moments before the accident. Sustained, Judge Morrison replied. Ms. Kane, please limit your testimony to what you observed, not your interpretations of the defendant's intentions. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, guided me through the factual details of the attack, the speed of Brandon's vehicle, the absence of brake lights, the trajectory that suggested deliberate aim rather than loss of control. But the most damning testimony came when she asked about the events leading up to the attack. Ms. Kane, did you have any interactions with the defendant or his family in the days before you were struck by his vehicle? Yes, the day before the attack, I had lunch with Brandon and our aunt, Cordelia Kane. They asked me to withdraw from a legal case I was handling, the Morrison estate case. Did they give you a reason for this request? They told me the case involved fraudulent activity that could damage my legal career if I continued with it. And how did you respond? I investigated their claims and discovered they were false. The charity named in Eugene Morrison's will was completely legitimate. I informed them the next morning that I would be continuing with the case. And approximately 6 hours after you informed them of your decision to continue with the case, you were struck by Mr. Kane's vehicle? That's correct. Brandon's lead attorney, Marcus Whitfield, a man whose reputation for defending wealthy clients accused of violent crimes was matched only by his $800 per hour billing rate, cross-examined me for over an hour, trying to establish that the attack had been accidental, that I might have been mistaken about Brandon's intentions, that the family lunch had been unrelated to the subsequent events, but every question only reinforced the deliberate nature of what had happened. Ms. Kane, isn't it possible that you misinterpreted your family's concerns about the Morrison case? Perhaps they were genuinely trying to protect you from legal complications? If they were trying to protect me, why did they lie about the charity being fraudulent? Objection. Non-responsive. Overruled. The witness may answer. If they were trying to protect me, why did Brandon try to kill me less than 24 hours after I refused to do what they wanted? The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Morrison gavelled for order, but the damage was done. The connection between the family pressure and the attempted murder was now part of the official record. The most devastating testimony came from Detective Castellanos, who presented the physical evidence with the methodical precision of someone who'd built dozens of similar cases over 2 decades. The tire marks at the scene show a clear pattern of acceleration leading up to the point of impact. There is no evidence of panic braking, no indication that the driver attempted to avoid the collision. The security footage confirms that Mr. Kane positioned his vehicle to have clear sightlines of the building exit and began accelerating the moment Miss Kane appeared. In your professional opinion, Detective, was this collision accidental or intentional? Based on the physical evidence, the security footage, and the defendant's behavior before and after the incident, this was an intentional act of vehicular assault. Brandon's advocate fought back hard during cross-examination, suggesting that the tire marks could be interpreted differently, that the security footage was unclear, that my cousin had been traumatized by the accident and wasn't thinking clearly in the immediate aftermath. But Detective Castellanos had seen too many cases to be shaken by aggressive questioning. Mr. Whitfield, in 23 years of investigating vehicular incidents, I've never seen tire marks like these from an accidental collision. The defendant accelerated continuously until impact, then braked immediately afterward. That's not the pattern of someone who lost control of their vehicle. The preliminary hearing lasted 2 days with testimony from medical experts about my injuries, automotive specialists about the condition of Brandon's car, and digital forensics experts about the cell phone communications between Brandon and Aunt Cordelia leading up to the attack. By the end, even Brandon's expensive legal team looked defeated. Judge Morrison bound the case over for trial on charges of attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and conspiracy. Brandon's bail was revoked after the prosecution successfully argued that he posed a continued threat to my safety and might flee the jurisdiction if released.
As the court officers led Brandon away in handcuffs, he finally looked at me directly for the first time since the hearing began. The expression on his face wasn't remorse or shame or even anger. It was calculation, the same look I'd seen in that split second before his car slammed into my body. He was still trying to figure out how to win. The civil proceedings began the following week in a different courthouse, but with many of the same players. The Kane family had hired Morrison, Blackwell, and Associates, one of the most prestigious defense firms in the state, to represent them in the wrongful injury lawsuit I'd filed. Leading their team was Patricia Morrison, a woman whose reputation for destroying plaintiffs in cross-examination was legendary among the local bar. But they were fighting a war on multiple fronts now. The estate lawsuit filed by Eugene Morrison's executor was proceeding simultaneously, seeking recovery of the fraudulent loans and profits that had been uncovered during the criminal investigation. The State Bar Association had launched their own inquiry into the anonymous complaint against me, which had ironically backfired by drawing official attention to my family's financial improprieties. David Hartwell had assembled our own legal team, including a forensic accountant who specialized in family business fraud and a private investigator who'd been digging into the Kane family enterprises for weeks. What they'd found was a pattern of financial manipulation that went far beyond the Morrison case. "Alexandra," David said during one of our strategy sessions, "your family has been running what amounts to a Ponzi scheme for over a decade. They borrow money from wealthy elderly investors, use it to fund their lifestyle and other business ventures, then either default on the loans or structure repayments in ways that benefit them rather than the lenders." How many victims are we talking about? At least 12 that we've identified so far. Total losses in excess of $8 million. The scope of the fraud was staggering, but it also explained why my family had been willing to attempt murder to prevent exposure. They weren't just facing embarrassment or civil liability, they were looking at potential criminal charges that could result in decades in prison. The first major confrontation came during depositions for the civil case. Aunt Cordelia arrived at the law offices of Morrison, Blackwell, and Associates, looking every inch the respectable matriarch she'd always pretended to be. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her navy suit was expensive and conservative, and her demeanor projected the kind of wounded dignity that had always been her most effective manipulation tool. But depositions aren't family dinners or emotional confrontations. They're legal proceedings governed by rules of evidence and procedure, where lies can be exposed through careful questioning and documentation. David handled her deposition personally, spending 4 hours methodically destroying the carefully constructed narrative she'd been building since the night Brandon tried to kill me. "Mrs. Kane, you testified that you arrived at the scene of the collision by coincidence. Is that correct?" "Yes, I was in the area shopping and heard the commotion." "Which stores did you visit that afternoon?" I'm not sure I remember exactly." "Do you have any receipts from purchases made that afternoon?" "I may not have bought anything, I was just browsing." David placed a stack of documents on the table. "These are cell phone records showing 17 calls between your phone and Brandon Kane's phone on the day of the attack. The final call lasted 6 minutes and ended approximately 3 minutes before Miss Kane left her meeting. Can you explain the nature of these communications?" Cordelia's composure cracked slightly. "We talk regularly. He's my nephew." 17 times in one day? He was going through a difficult time. Personal issues. What kind of personal issues required 17 phone calls on the day he attempted to murder his cousin? "Objection," Patricia Morrison interjected. "Assumes facts not in evidence." But the damage was done. The pattern of communication, combined with the timing of Cordelia's arrival at the scene, painted a clear picture of coordination and planning. The financial depositions were even more devastating. Uncle Thomas, Brandon's father and the primary beneficiary of the fraudulent loan scheme, looked like he'd aged 10 years in the months since the criminal investigation began. His expensive attorney tried to limit questioning to the specific allegations in our lawsuit, but David had done his homework. "Mr. Kane, You borrowed $1.2 million from Eugene Morrison in 2019 for what you described as a real estate development opportunity. Where did that money actually go? It went into the development project as agreed. David slid a forensic accounting report across the table. This analysis of your business and personal financial records shows that within 2 weeks of receiving Mr. Morrison's money, you made payments totaling $400,000 to various casinos in Atlantic City and Las Vegas. Were those payments related to the real estate development project? Uncle Thomas's face went pale. Those were legitimate business expenses. $400,000 in casino payments were legitimate business expenses for a real estate development project? We were entertaining potential investors. For 2 years straight? The questioning continued for 6 hours, with each answer revealing new layers of fraud and deception. By the end, Uncle Thomas looked like a broken man, and his attorney was frantically taking notes for what was obviously going to be a settlement discussion. But the most important deposition was Brandon's. He'd been advised by his criminal defense team not to testify, since anything he said could be used against him in the murder trial. But the civil case required him to either appear for deposition or face default judgment. He chose to appear, clearly believing that his charm and family connections would carry him through the questioning. He was wrong. David started with seemingly innocuous questions about Brandon's relationship with me, his involvement in the family business, his knowledge of the Morrison case. But then the questioning turned to the lunch meeting and the events of October 15th. Brandon, at the lunch meeting on October 14th, you asked Miss Kane to withdraw from the Morrison estate case, is that correct?
We expressed concerns about potential complications. What kind of complications? Legal complications that might affect her career. Were those concerns based on accurate information? Brandon hesitated, clearly aware that this was dangerous territory. We believed them to be accurate at the time, but they weren't accurate, were they? The charity named in Eugene Morrison's will was completely legitimate. We may have been mistaken about some details. So you lied to your cousin about fraudulent activity in order to manipulate her into withdrawing from a case that threatened your father's financial interests? Objection, Patricia Morrison interjected. Compound question. Assumes facts not in evidence. But Brandon was already answering, his composure finally cracking under the pressure of systematic questioning. We weren't trying to manipulate anyone. We were trying to protect the family. Protect the family from what? From complications that could hurt everyone, such as exposure of your father's fraudulent loans from Eugene Morrison? They weren't fraudulent. They were legitimate business arrangements. David placed a stack of documents on the table, copies of the loan agreements, bank records, and correspondence between Uncle Thomas and Eugene Morrison. These records show that your father borrowed over $3 million from Mr. Morrison over 15 years, with minimal repayment and no legitimate business purpose for many of the loans. Were you aware of these financial arrangements when you asked Miss Kane to withdraw from the case? Brandon stared at the documents for a long moment, clearly realizing that his family's financial crimes were now part of the official record and multiple legal proceedings. I was aware that there were business relationships. And when Miss Kane refused to withdraw from the case, you decided to eliminate her by running her down with your car? No, that was an accident. The accelerator stuck. Is that why you positioned your car to have clear sightlines of the building where she was meeting? I wasn't positioned anywhere. I was just leaving the parking lot. Is that why you waited in that parking lot for over an hour before she appeared? I wasn't waiting. I was making phone calls. 17 phone calls to your Aunt Cordelia, including one that ended 3 minutes before you accelerated into Miss Kane. Brandon's attorney finally managed to stop the questioning, but the damage was complete. His testimony, combined with the physical evidence and financial records, created an overwhelming case for premeditated, attempted murder motivated by family financial fraud.
As we walked out of the deposition that evening, David looked exhausted but satisfied. Alexandra, they're going to want to settle both the civil and criminal cases. The evidence is too strong, and they can't afford to have all of this financial fraud exposed in open court. What kind of settlement are we talking about? Full financial restitution to you and the Morrison estate, criminal plea agreements that include significant prison time, dissolution of the family business enterprises, essentially the complete destruction of everything they've built over the past 20 years. I thought about Brandon sitting in that conference room, finally understanding that his attempt to kill me had triggered the exposure of decades of criminal activity. I thought about Uncle Thomas, realizing that his gambling debts and fraudulent loans were now public record. I thought about Aunt Cordelia's carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of documented lies and conspiracy charges. They brought this on themselves, I said finally. Every bit of it. Yes, they did. But Alexandra, there's something else you need to consider. Once all of this becomes public record through the court proceedings, your family name is going to be associated with fraud, attempted murder, and organized criminal activity. That could affect your legal career and personal life for years to come. I looked back at the building where I'd just spent 8 hours systematically destroying the people who'd raised me, taught me about family loyalty, and then tried to kill me to protect their secrets. David, they stopped being my family the moment Brandon aimed that car at me. Whatever happens to the Kane name now, they earned it. The next morning, I received a call from Patricia Morrison, the attorney representing my family in the civil case. Miss Kane, my clients would like to discuss resolution of all pending legal matters. Are you available for a settlement conference? I'm listening. Full financial restitution, public apology, and cooperation with all ongoing criminal investigations in exchange for your agreement to not pursue additional damages or publicity. I thought about Brandon in his jail cell, about Uncle Thomas's gambling debts and fraudulent loans, about Aunt Cordelia's lies. I thought about the tire marks in that parking lot that had started this entire cascade of justice. Miss Morrison, please tell your clients that I'll consider their offer, but they should understand that they're not negotiating from a position of strength. They tried to kill me, and they failed. Now they're going to face the consequences. The settlement conference was scheduled for the following week, but I already knew what my answer would be. No deal, no compromise, no mercy. They tried to silence me with violence. Instead, they'd given me a voice that would finally tell the truth about what the Kane family really was.
But the most satisfying moment came when Judge Morrison asked if I wanted to deliver a victim impact statement before pronouncing Brandon's sentence. I walked to the podium with the same measured confidence I brought to oral arguments, but this time I wasn't advocating for a client. I was speaking for myself, for Eugene Morrison, and for every victim of my family's decades-long criminal enterprise. Your Honor, I began, looking directly at Brandon for the first time since his deposition. The defendant didn't just try to kill me that day in the parking lot. He tried to silence the truth about what my family had been doing to vulnerable, elderly victims for over 15 years. Brandon sat between his attorneys, his orange prison jumpsuit a stark contrast to the expensive suits he'd worn during the early hearings. He looked older, thinner, broken in ways that went beyond mere physical deterioration. Prison had not been kind to a man who'd spent his life coasting on family wealth and privilege. When I refused to withdraw from the Morrison estate case, Brandon saw me as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a family member to be reasoned with. That calculation, that my life was worth less than protecting their financial crimes, reveals something fundamental about the people who raised me. I turned to face the gallery, where several of my family's elderly victims sat with their own families, finally seeing justice after years of financial abuse. But Brandon's attempt to kill me had the opposite effect of what he intended. Instead of silencing me, it gave me the motivation and legal standing to expose everything. The tire marks he left in that parking lot became the foundation for investigations that recovered millions of dollars for fraud victims and put multiple criminals behind bars. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. Ms. Kane, how has this experience affected your life and career? Initially, I worried that being associated with my family's crimes would destroy my legal career, but the opposite happened.
Standing up to corruption, even when it came from my own family, established my reputation as an attorney who puts justice above personal relationships. My practice has grown significantly as a result, and I've been able to help other families victimized by financial fraud. It was true. In the 6 months since the story broke, my law firm had been flooded with cases involving elder abuse, family business fraud, and inheritance disputes. I'd become something of a specialist in complex financial crimes, earning referrals from prosecutors, other attorneys, and advocacy groups throughout the region. More importantly, I'd found purpose in the work that went beyond mere professional success. Every fraudulent scheme I helped expose, every elderly victim who recovered stolen assets, every criminal who faced justice, all of it felt connected to that moment in the parking lot when Brandon's car slammed into my body and changed the trajectory of my life. Your Honor, I continued, I want the defendant to serve the maximum sentence allowable under his plea agreement, not because I'm vengeful, but because his actions represent the culmination of a family culture that treated other people as disposable obstacles to their financial gain. That mindset led to years of elder abuse, and it led to attempted murder. It needs to be punished accordingly. Judge Morrison sentenced Brandon to 22 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years. As the bailiff led him away, he looked back at me one final time, and I saw something I'd never expected. Acceptance. Not remorse, exactly, but a kind of weary acknowledgement that the consequences he was facing had been earned through his own choices. The civil lawsuits had been resolved months earlier through a settlement that required the Kane family enterprises to pay $12.8 million in restitution to fraud victims, including Eugene Morrison's estate. The money came from liquidating virtually every asset the family had accumulated over 2 decades: real estate holdings, business interests, personal property, and investment accounts that had been funded through fraudulent means. I received $2.3 million for my own injuries and suffering, money that I used to establish the Eugene Morrison Foundation for Elder Financial Protection. The foundation provided legal assistance to elderly victims of financial fraud and funded research into family business abuse patterns. It was a fitting tribute to the man whose will had inadvertently exposed my family's crimes. But the most profound changes weren't financial or professional, they were personal. For the first time in my adult life, I was free from the toxic dynamics that had defined my relationships with my extended family. No more carefully navigated conversations that avoided uncomfortable topics. No more feeling obligated to maintain relationships with people who saw me as useful rather than valued. No more wondering whether the people who claimed to love me actually had my best interests at heart. The Kane family name, once synonymous with business success and community respectability in Millbrook Falls, was now permanently associated with fraud, attempted murder, and criminal conspiracy. Local newspapers had covered every aspect of the trials, and the story had been picked at criminal behavior. I'd changed my name legally 6 months after Brandon's conviction, taking my mother's maiden name of Alexander. It was partly practical, distancing myself professionally from the Kane family crimes, but mostly symbolic. I was finally free to define myself independently of family expectations and manipulations. The process of rebuilding my identity had been surprisingly liberating. For years, I'd tried to balance my professional success with maintaining family relationships that were fundamentally dishonest. I'd attended dinners where I pretended not to notice the expensive purchases that didn't match declared income. I'd listened to business discussions that skirted the edges of legal behavior. I'd accepted explanations that didn't quite make sense because questioning them would have been disloyal. Now, surrounded by colleagues who respected my work rather than tolerated my success, building relationships based on mutual trust rather than blood obligation, I realized how much energy I was wasting on people who saw me as a useful tool rather than a beloved family member. The revelation wasn't entirely painful. It was also profoundly freeing. 1 year after the attack, I received an unexpected visitor at my law office. Detective Ray Castellanos, now retired from the Millbrook Falls Police Department, had stopped by to update me on some follow-up investigations that had emerged from the Kane family prosecutions. "Alexandra," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk, I wanted to let you know that your case opened doors to investigations we never could have pursued otherwise. We've identified at least 6 other families in the region who were running similar fraud schemes, targeting elderly investors with fake business opportunities and inflated loan arrangements. How many victims? Over 40, with total losses approaching $15 million. Your willingness to expose your own family's crimes gave other victims the courage to come forward with their own stories. The scope of the impact was staggering, but it also explained something that had puzzled me throughout the legal proceedings. Several times during depositions and plea negotiations, prosecutors had hinted at ongoing investigations that I wasn't privy to. Apparently, the Kane family's systematic fraud had been part of a much larger pattern of elder abuse that had been operating throughout the region for years. Detective, can I ask you something? When you first interviewed me in the hospital, did you believe my story about the attack being deliberate? He smiled, the kind of expression that comes from years of dealing with complex criminal cases. Honestly, I believed you, but I've learned to be skeptical of family violence cases. People often have complicated motives for accusing relatives of crimes, but the physical evidence was so clear-cut that personal dynamics didn't matter. Those tire marks told the story better than any witness testimony could have. Do you think Brandon would have tried again if the first attempt had failed? Detective Castellanos considered this question for a moment. Based on the financial pressures your family was facing and the systematic nature of their criminal behavior, yes, I think they would have escalated until they eliminated what they saw as the threat to their operation. You were never safe as long as you were willing to stand up to them. That conversation stayed with me for weeks. The realization that Brandon's attempt to kill me hadn't been an isolated act of desperation, but part of a calculated strategy to preserve a criminal enterprise through violence, reinforced my decision to pursue maximum penalties for everyone involved. But it also made me grateful for the tire marks that had preserved the truth. Without that physical evidence, my accusations might have been dismissed as family drama or personal vendetta. The parking lot asphalt had become an unwitting witness that couldn't be intimidated, bribed, or manipulated. 2 years after the attack, I was invited to speak at a national conference on family business fraud and elder financial abuse. The audience was composed of prosecutors, law enforcement officers, elder care advocates, and attorneys who specialized in financial crimes. My presentation focused on recognizing the warning signs of systematic family fraud and the legal strategies for prosecuting complex, multi-generational criminal enterprises. But the most important part of my talk dealt with something more personal: the psychology of family loyalty and how it can be weaponized to enable criminal behavior. The Kane family crimes weren't just about money. They were about power, control, and the assumption that family members could be counted on to prioritize loyalty over justice. My relatives didn't see their elderly victims as people. They saw them as resources to be exploited. And they didn't see me as a person either when I threatened their operation. They saw me as a problem to be eliminated. The attempted murder wasn't an escalation of their criminal behavior, it was a natural extension of it. When you dehumanize others for financial gain, violence becomes just another business tool. After the presentation, I was approached by Sarah Chen, an FBI agent who specialized in organized financial crime. She handed me her business card with a request that both honored and humbled me. Miss Alexander, we're developing a task force to investigate family-based financial crimes targeting vulnerable populations. Your experience as both a victim and a prosecutor of these crimes would be invaluable. Would you consider serving as a consulting attorney for our investigations? I looked at the business card, thinking about Eugene Morrison, about all the elderly victims who'd trusted my family and been systematically defrauded, and the tire marks that had started this entire journey toward justice. Agent Chen, I'd be honored to help, but I have one condition. What's that? Any families we investigate get the chance to make things right voluntarily before we pursue criminal charges. I want to give them the opportunity I gave my own family, to choose justice over self-preservation.
And if they refuse? I thought about Brandon in his prison cell, about Uncle Thomas serving his federal sentence, about Aunt Cordelia learning to live with the consequences of her choices. Then they faced the same consequences as the Kane family, because some tire marks can't be erased, no matter how much money or influence you think you have. 5 years after Brandon tried to kill me, I received a letter from him in prison. It was the first communication I had had from any member of my biological family since the sentencing hearings, and I almost threw it away without reading it. But curiosity won out over caution. The letter was surprisingly brief, and to my shock, genuinely apologetic.
Alexandra, I know I have no right to contact you, and I don't expect forgiveness or even a response. But I wanted you to know that prison has given me time to understand what I became and what I did to you and others. I was raised to believe that family loyalty meant protecting our interests above everything else, including the truth and other people's welfare. I see now that it actually meant enabling criminal behavior and ultimately attempting murder. You were right to expose us, and you were right to refuse our settlement offers. The people we hurt deserve justice, and you deserve to survive and build a life free from our toxicity. I'm sorry for what I did to you, and I'm sorry for what we all did to the people who trusted us. You became the person our family should have been, someone who chose justice over convenience, truth over loyalty, courage over complicity. I hope your life is everything it should be. I read the letter 3 times, looking for manipulation or self-serving justification, but found only what appeared to be genuine remorse and hard-won self-awareness. It didn't change anything about what he'd done or the consequences he was facing, but it suggested that 5 years of imprisonment had accomplished what a lifetime of family wealth and privilege had failed to do. It had taught him accountability. I didn't respond to the letter, but I kept it in my desk drawer as a reminder that even the most damaged people can sometimes find their way to truth and remorse. It also reminded me that the justice I'd fought for hadn't just been about punishment. It had been about forcing accountability that might eventually lead to genuine change. Today, as I write this, I run the largest family financial crimes practice in the region. The Eugene Morrison Foundation has helped recover over $30 million in fraudulent assets for elderly victims throughout the state. The FBI task force I joined has prosecuted dozens of family-based fraud schemes and developed new investigative techniques that are being used nationally. But the most meaningful change has been personal. I'm married now to David Hartwell, my former law partner who stood by me through the darkest period of my life. We have a daughter, Emma, who will grow up understanding that family isn't defined by blood relationships, but by love, respect, and mutual support. When Emma is old enough, I'll tell her the story of her name, how she's named after Eugene Morrison, the man whose will inadvertently saved my life by exposing the family crimes that led to attempted murder. I'll teach her that sometimes the most important stand you can take is against the people who claim to love you but actually see you as disposable. And I'll make sure she understands that tire marks in parking lots can change the world if you're brave enough to follow where they lead. The Kane family thought they could erase the evidence of their crimes through violence. Instead, those tire marks became the beginning of their downfall and the foundation of my new life. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation, accountability, and the courage to choose truth over family loyalty when the two are in conflict. I chose truth, and for the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.